I remember the headlines from 19... A major developing nation on the brink of collapse. India, home to nearly 1 billion people, was running out of foreign exchange reserves. Just enough to cover about 2 weeks of imports. 2 weeks. It was the kind of crisis that would make even the strongest governments tremble. That year, India was forced to do something that shocked the world. It flew 47 tons of gold, its national reserve, to London and Switzerland, just to secure a loan from the International Monetary Fund. For many, it was a moment of national humiliation. For others, a necessary evil. But for history, it was the moment that triggered one of the greatest economic transformations of the modern age. You see, the India of today, poised to become the third largest economy in the world, was born from that collapse. And few outside India truly understand how dramatic, how deliberate, and how improbable that journey has been. The crisis was real. In the late 80s, India's economy was limping, over-regulated, inward-looking, drowning in bureaucratic red tape. The so-called license Raj, a complex maze of permissions, quotas, and restrictions, suffocated innovation. And when the Gulf War in 1990 triggered an oil shock, India's already fragile finances fell apart. Inflation soared, imports became impossible, investors fled, and the world watched a nuclear-armed, populist democracy teeter on the edge of insolvency. Then came something unexpected: quiet, almost reluctant reform. Prime Minister Narasimha Rao, often described as understated, teamed up with an economist named Manmohan Singh, who would later become Prime Minister himself. Together they began to dismantle decades of socialist-era policies, but not with slogans or revolutions, with spreadsheets, with structural reform. They opened up India's economy to foreign investors. They abolished industrial licensing in most sectors. They reduced tariffs. They allowed the rupee to float. And perhaps most importantly, they did all of this without plunging the country into chaos. It was a balancing act few thought possible. A democracy pushing reform without a mandate. A government cutting through decades of ideology without breaking social order. But it worked. Slowly, then suddenly. By the late 1990s, India was growing. And not just growing, it was changing character. The world had long known India as a country of philosophers, of poverty, of politics. But now it was becoming something else. A country of coders, of consultants, of call centers, and capital markets. The information technology boom began quietly, but it would redefine India's place in the global economy. By the time the 2000s arrived, something had shifted in boardrooms across the West. If you wanted scale, you went to China. But if you wanted brains, you looked to India. American tech companies began hiring Indian engineers en masse. Indian CEOs began rising to the top of Fortune 500 firms. And a middle class began to emerge, hungry, ambitious, and globally aware. And yet this was not a smooth ride. There were setbacks. The 1997 Asian financial crisis, the 2008 global crash, periods of political uncertainty, infrastructure bottlenecks, persistent poverty. And yet through it all, India's economic rise never quite reversed. It absorbed shocks, it adapted, it endured. In 2014, a new chapter began. Narendra Modi took office, and whether one agrees with him politically or not, his government brought with it a renewed focus on modernization. Digital India, Make in India, Startup India, schemes that were mocked by some but slowly began to shift the landscape. UPI, India's digital payment platform, became a global model. Millions of people entered the formal economy through Aadhaar-based identification. And crucially, India began to imagine itself not as a developing country, but as a global competitor. And here we are today. India has overtaken the United Kingdom in GDP. The irony doesn't escape me. The colonizer now lags behind the former colony. India sits among the top 5 economies of the world, with a young population, rising consumer demand, a thriving startup ecosystem, and a level of geopolitical respect it hasn't held in decades. And what makes this story so compelling is not just that India rose, but how it rose. It did not follow the Chinese model. It did not surrender to populism. It reformed slowly, reluctantly, democratically. And that makes its achievement all the more rare. In a world where many believe that only authoritarian states can deliver fast economic growth, India stands as a living contradiction. It argues silently but firmly that a noisy, complex, diverse democracy can still succeed, that reforms can come not from revolution, but from resilience. The transformation isn't over. There are still deep challenges: unemployment, inequality, rural stagnation, but the trajectory is clear. And it's no longer just India's story, it's a global story. One that economists, investors, and policymakers ignore at their own peril. When I look at India today, I don't just see GDP numbers or export charts. I see a country that learned from its crisis without being broken by it. A nation that didn't just recover from collapse, but used it as a springboard. That is rare, that is powerful, and that I believe is worth understanding. India's rise did not come from oil wealth. It didn't come from colonizing others or dominating trade routes. It came from something more enduring: human capital. Mines, not minerals. The Indian economy, especially since the early 2000s, has been driven by its people. Young, educated, multilingual, and increasingly digital. It started with the IT and services sector, which today accounts for more than 7% of India's GDP and over 50% of its exports. Indian companies like Infosys, TCS, and Wipro became household names in boardrooms across the West. Business process outsourcing, BPOs, sprang up in cities like Bengaluru, Hyderabad, Pune. India became the back office of the world, but it didn't stop there. By 2010, India was no longer just doing the world's paperwork. It was writing its code, designing its software, managing its servers. More than 4 million people now work in India's IT sector. And that sector, unlike the old industries of the West, was born global. India's service economy wasn't just serving Indians, it was serving the world. And in doing so, it brought in foreign currency, built brand India, and seeded a generation of digital entrepreneurs. Then came the startup revolution. Once the idea of building $1 billion company in India seemed fanciful, today, India is home to over 100 unicorns. Startups like Flipkart, BYJu's, Ola, Zomato, Paytm, some of them flawed, some of them brilliant, but all of them bold. They changed not only how Indians shop, eat, travel, and learn, but also how India sees itself. No longer as a follower, but as a creator. In the past decade, the government has played an increasingly strategic role. Critics often point to bureaucracy and red tape, but there's another side to the story. India has built one of the most advanced digital public infrastructures in the world. The Aadhaar biometric identity system, covering over 1.3 billion people, enables everything from bank accounts to subsidies to digital signatures. Then there's UPI, the Unified Payments Interface, a real-time mobile-first payment system that now processes more digital payments than the US and China combined. And it was built not by a private company, but by the Indian state. Think about that. In a world dominated by PayPal, Apple Pay, and Alipay, India built a homegrown alternative, one that even Silicon Valley now admires. UPI didn't just bring convenience, it brought financial inclusion. Vegetable vendors, rickshaw drivers, and rural merchants now transact in seconds, with no credit cards, no fees, no banks. This is what makes India's economic rise unique. It's not just skyscrapers in Mumbai or stock market rallies in Delhi. It's not just foreign reserves or IPOs. It's the deeper structural transformation, from a cash-based economy to a digital one, from informality to formality, from a country of the poor to a country with a rising middle class. India today has over 800 million internet users, nearly 700 million smartphone users, and more than 60% of the population is under the age of 35. That's not just a demographic statistic, it's an economic force. A force that buys, builds, consumes, and creates. Foreign investors have noticed. In 2023, India surpassed China as the most attractive destination for foreign direct investment in several key sectors, especially semiconductors, electronics, defense manufacturing, and renewable energy. Companies like Apple, Foxconn, Tesla, and Samsung are shifting parts of their supply chain to India, not just because of cost, but because of trust. India is increasingly seen as a stable, democratic alternative to authoritarian risk, and geopolitics plays into this too. India has positioned itself carefully, almost masterfully, in global affairs. It maintains strategic autonomy. It's part of the Quad with the US, Japan, and Australia. It's a leader in BRICS. It talks to Russia without alienating the West. It maintains strong ties with Israel, yet has influence in the Middle East. It supports the Global South, yet cooperates with G7. This balancing act of being everywhere, without being trapped anywhere, is perhaps India's greatest foreign policy achievement. And its economy benefits. It's no longer about aid, it's about alliances, no longer about survival, it's about shaping the future. And as the world fragments into competing blocks, India is becoming the bridge between East and West, North and South, old powers and emerging ones. But for me, the most remarkable part of this story is not India's scale, it's India's trajectory. Countries rise, but they often rise by abandoning who they are. India, for all its contradictions, has risen while remaining noisy, democratic, diverse, and difficult to manage. That makes its economic ascent more surprising and more impressive. This is not a story of perfection, it's a story of persistence. Let's now look deeper into the pillars that are propelling India forward. The world often reduces India's economy to IT services and consumer demand. But that's only half the picture. The rest, it's in the factories, skies, satellites, and farmlands of a nation quietly transforming at scale. One of the most significant shifts underway is India's manufacturing resurgence. For decades, India was seen as missing the manufacturing bus, a services-first economy in a factory-first world. But now that's changing. Under the Make in India initiative, the country has begun building its industrial muscle. Global electronics giants are shifting production to India. Apple's iPhones are now assembled in Tamil Nadu and Karnataka. In fact, India is projected to manufacture over 25% of Apple's total iPhones by 2020. Foxconn, Samsung, and Dell are ramping up their footprints. India has become the world's second largest mobile phone manufacturer, not by accident, but by design. Semiconductors, a sector dominated by East Asia, is now part of India's strategic agenda. The government is offering incentives worth billions of dollars to attract chip makers. And in a post-pandemic world where supply chains are being rewritten, India's democratic stability offers something priceless: predictability. Then comes defense manufacturing, a space long dominated by imports. Today, India is not just buying jets and missiles, it is building them. Hale's Tejas fighter jet, DRDO's missile systems, and domestic naval ships are part of a broader push to reduce dependence on foreign arms and become a net defense exporter. In 2024, India's defense exports touched an all-time high of over 21,000 crore, with deals across Southeast Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Few realize it, but India is now among the top 25 defense exporters globally. Another unsung pillar is space technology. India's ISRO, once mocked for its budget frugality, is now revered for its precision. In 2014, India became the first Asian nation to reach Mars, and it did so on a budget smaller than Hollywood's movie Gravity. In 2023, India achieved something historic. Chandrayaan-3 successfully landed on the moon's south pole. No other nation had done that. That same year, ISRO launched Aditya L1, the country's first solar observatory, and began plans for Gaganyaan, India's first manned space mission. But why does space matter to India's economy? Because it powers the future. Satellites support agriculture, telecom, navigation, disaster management, climate forecasting, and military intelligence. India's space economy, currently valued at $9 billion, is expected to grow to $40 billion by 2040, making it one of the most dynamic sectors. Now consider renewable energy. As the world turns its eyes to climate resilience, India is positioning itself as a clean energy leader. With over 125 gigawatts of installed renewable capacity, India ranks 4th in the world for wind power and 5th for solar. It's home to the world's largest solar power plant, and it leads the International Solar Alliance, a coalition of 120-plus countries. Why is this important? Because energy isn't just about sustainability, it's about sovereignty. The more energy India can generate from its own sun and wind, the less it relies on foreign oil. And in geopolitical terms, that's power. Then there's agriculture, often seen as India's past, but increasingly becoming part of its future. Agritech startups are digitizing farming. Drone-based soil monitoring, AI-powered yield predictions, and blockchain-enabled supply chains are connecting Indian farmers to global markets. And with over 50% of India's population still tied to agriculture, this modernization isn't just economic, it's existential. So where does all this lead? Let's look at the scoreboard. In 2023, India's GDP surpassed $3.7 trillion, overtaking the UK to become the 5th largest economy in the world. By 2030, most projections, including those by Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and PwC, place India as the 3rd largest, behind only the United States and China. Its foreign exchange reserves remain strong, averaging over $600 billion, making it among the top 5 holders globally. Its export base has diversified, from software and services to machinery, electronics, pharmaceuticals, textiles, and space components. And the most underrated indicator, confidence. India's youth now aspire to create, not just to earn, to build companies, not just chase jobs, to lead globally, not just follow trends. This psychological shift of ambition, ownership, and belief might just be India's most valuable economic asset. But let's be honest, challenges remain. Unemployment, especially among youth, is real. Wealth inequality is growing. Urban-rural divides persist. Red tape, though reduced, still exists. And infrastructure, while improving, needs massive investment. Yet despite these, the momentum is unmistakable. India is no longer asking to be included in the global economic order. It is shaping it. And for anyone watching from the outside, as I do, the question is no longer if India will lead, but how it chooses to lead. So where does this journey go from here? India stands at an extraordinary crossroads. On one side, it carries the legacy of an ancient civilization, a land that gave the world mathematics, philosophy, and spiritual wisdom. On the other, it is a nation of coders, engineers, entrepreneurs, and space scientists, writing the next chapters of human innovation. This fusion of past and future is India's true power. The world is noticing, and not just in headlines or markets, but in geopolitics, academia, and boardrooms. In the last G20 summit, hosted in Delhi, India, wasn't just a participant, it was the stage setter. It brought the African Union into the G20. It spoke not just for South Asia, but for the entire global South. It positioned itself not as a follower of Western blocs or Eastern powers, but as a civilizational state with independent agency. There's a growing understanding now, even in the West, that India isn't trying to become another China. It isn't trying to copy anyone's model. It is instead attempting something far harder, to become a modern superpower without abandoning democracy, without sacrificing pluralism, and without losing its identity. That doesn't mean the journey will be smooth. India will face turbulence, internal political tensions, environmental stress, global headwinds, but it has faced worse and emerged stronger. And here's the striking part. For most of its modern history, India was framed as a problem to be solved. Too poor, too complex, too chaotic. But today, India is increasingly being viewed as a solution to global problems. Need a trusted manufacturing partner? India. Need a digital public infrastructure model? India. Need a neutral negotiator between Russia and the West? India. Need a stable democracy in an unstable region? India. This shift from problem to partner is not just perceptual, it's strategic, and perhaps even philosophical. Because India, in many ways, offers a different answer to the 21st century question: can you rise without violence, modernize without oppression, grow without losing your soul? And while no country is perfect, India is proving that it's possible to pursue prosperity with values intact. So what should the world understand about India's economic rise? That it's not a fluke, it's not fragile, and it's far from over. India is not a temporary bright spot, it is a structural force. By 2030, India is projected to be the third largest economy, behind only the United States and China. But size isn't everything. The real impact will come from influence in global governance, technology, trade, and the very imagination of the next generation. And what should India remember? That its greatest strength has never been GDP growth alone. It has been its ability to grow without losing cohesion, to reform without bloodshed, to rise, not on the ruins of others, but on the backs of its own determination. The gold that was flown out of India in 1991 to secure a loan was symbolic. It was seen as a loss, a moment of desperation, but in hindsight that moment was a turning point. Because what India got in return wasn't just liquidity, it was clarity, a wake-up call, a catalyst. And today, over 30 years later, that same India has become a creditor to the IMF. Yes, you heard that right. The country that once begged for loans now offers them. The nation that once sent its gold abroad now launches satellites into orbit. The economy that once relied on foreign aid now builds digital platforms for the world. And if you ask me what I see when I look at India today, it's this: not just the rise of a country, but the redefinition of what global leadership can look like in a fractured world. A leadership that is not loud, but lasting, not domineering, but dignified, not borrowed, but built from within. That is the untold story of India's rise, and we are only beginning to understand it.